47.5%. That is the cold, calculated statistical probability that if you were born 20,000 years ago, you would be dead before you reached your 5th birthday. To a modern mind, that number sounds like a total societal collapse, an extinction-level event unfolding in slow motion. Yet, it was the baseline reality for our ancestors for nearly 99% of our history. We look back at the idea of a 12-year-old having a child and we see a horror story, but to the evolutionary process, that 12-year-old wasn't a victim of circumstance. She was the winning bet in a high-stakes gamble against total erasure. We assume their lives were a frantic sprint because they were dying young, but the paradox is that they weren't actually dying as young as the numbers suggest. They were simply living in a world where the buffer between child and ancestor didn't exist. It seems obvious to conclude that if the average person only lived to be 30, they had to start having families by 12 just to keep the species going. But that logic is built on a fundamental misunderstanding of how math describes a human life. When you hear that life expectancy in the Upper Paleolithic or the Bronze Age was 30 years, your brain likely pictures a world of gray-haired 30-year-olds hobbling around on canes. That world never existed. That 30-year average is a mathematical ghost created by the sheer volume of infants who didn't survive their first year. If you could make it past the gauntlet of early childhood, if you reached the age of 15, your statistical life expectancy didn't end at 30. It shot up into the 50s, 60s, and even 70s. The ancient world was full of grandparents. They just had to survive a brutal elimination round to get there. However, just because they weren't all dropping dead at 30 doesn't mean they had the luxury of time. The math of survival in a pre-industrial world wasn't about how long you could live, but how many people you could leave behind before the next famine or plague arrived. In a society where half of all children die, a mother doesn't just need to have 2 children to replace herself and her partner. She needs to have 4, 5, or 6, just to ensure that 2 might make it to adulthood. If you start that process at 25, you've already lost your most fertile years and narrowed your window for error to a razor-thin margin. The pressure to start early wasn't born from a fear of being old at 30, it was born from the statistical necessity of having as many attempts at a surviving lineage as possible before your biology or your environment caught up with you. You might assume this meant ancient women were biological sprinters, hitting puberty at the first possible moment to begin this reproductive marathon. Yet, for most of history, the human body was actually doing exactly the opposite. There is a famous biological concept called the critical fat mass hypothesis, pioneered by researcher Rose Frisch in the 1970s and 80s. Frisch's work, which remains a cornerstone of human biology, suggests that a female body will not trigger the hormonal cascade of puberty until it has reached a specific ratio of body fat to lean muscle, roughly 17% for the start of the cycle and 22% to maintain regular fertility. In the ancient world, where calories were hard-won and physical labor was the daily reality, reaching that fat threshold was a massive hurdle. This creates a fascinating biological contradiction. While we see 12-year-old marriage in the historical record, many ancient foragers and hunter-gatherers didn't actually hit puberty until they were 16, 17, or even 18. When the body is under nutritional stress, it shuts down the most expensive luxury it possesses, reproduction. Growing a new human being is an energy sink that a starving body cannot afford. This means that for a large portion of human history, 12 wasn't even a biological possibility for motherhood. In groups like the Hadza of Tanzania, studied extensively by anthropologists like Frank Marlowe, the age of first birth often hovers closer to 19. The image of the prehistoric 12-year-old mother is, in many ways, a myth created by our own modern abundance, where high-calorie diets have pushed the age of puberty earlier and earlier. But that doesn't explain the written laws of the Greeks, the Romans, and the dynasties of the Middle Ages, which frequently cited 12 as the age of womanhood. If biology was pushing the start date back, why were the laws pushing it forward? The answer lies in the shift from wandering to settling. Once humans invented agriculture and began living in permanent cities, the energy math changed. Grain surpluses meant more reliable calories, which lowered the age of puberty. Suddenly, the biological window opened earlier, and the social machinery of the ancient world was ready to exploit it. In ancient Rome, the Lex Julia and other legal codes explicitly set the minimum age for marriage at 12 for girls. This wasn't because the Romans were uniquely obsessed with youth. It was because they viewed marriage as a tool for political and economic stability. In the Roman elite, a daughter wasn't a child to be protected from the world. She was a bridge between two powerful families. Waiting until she was 20 to marry her off was seen as a waste of a decade's worth of political alliances and potential heirs. We have historical records of girls like Agrippina the Younger, who was married at 13 to Domitius Ahenobarbus. In these urban, calorie-rich environments, the biological readiness of the body began to align with the cold, transactional needs of the state. It was a world where the concept of adolescence, that decade-long buffer of self-discovery and schooling we take for granted, simply did not exist. You were either a child who was a burden on the household, or you were an adult who contributed to its survival. It would be a mistake to think this was just about politics, though. Beneath the laws of Rome and the arranged marriages of the Middle Ages lies a deep evolutionary engine called life history theory. This is the study of how organisms allocate their limited energy between growth, maintenance, and reproduction. Biologists categorize environments into low mortality and high mortality. In a low mortality environment, like the one you likely live in, it makes sense to delay reproduction. You can spend 20 years growing, learning, and building resources because you are reasonably certain you will still be alive at 30 to have a child. But in a high mortality environment, where a scratch can turn into a fatal infection or a bad winter can wipe out a village, waiting is a death sentence for your genetic line. Evolutionary researchers like Stephen Stearns have documented this pattern across countless species. When the world is dangerous and unpredictable, the organisms that survive are the ones that reproduce early and often. For an ancient human, delaying motherhood until 21 wasn't responsible, it was a reckless gamble. If you died at 19 from a fever, your entire ancestral line, stretching back millions of years, ended with you. The choice, to have children at 12 or 13, where biologically possible, was the output of a survival algorithm that prioritized the continuation of the species over the health or longevity of the individual mother. It was a brutal trade-off, and the evidence of that trade-off is written directly into the bones of the women who lived through it. You might think that because early childbirth was common, the human body must have been designed to handle it. However, the physical reality of ancient motherhood tells a much darker story of biological misalignment. Anthropologists frequently point to a concept called the obstetric dilemma. This is the tension between two evolutionary pressures: our need to walk upright, which requires a narrow pelvis, and our need for large brains, which requires a wide birth canal. In a fully grown adult woman, this is already the most dangerous biological event in the animal kingdom. But in a 12 or 13-year-old, whose pelvis is still growing and whose bones have not yet fully ossified, it is a catastrophe. When we examine skeletal remains from ancient burial sites, such as those from the Romano-British period or medieval cemeteries in Europe, we find clear markers of this toll. The pelvic bones of young females often show pitting and stress fractures that indicate a body struggling to accommodate the massive physical requirements of labor before the skeletal structure was ready. In many cases, we find the remains of young teenagers buried with infants still in the birth canal, a coffin birth that serves as a silent, grim testament to the fact that their bodies simply weren't finished growing. The human pelvis doesn't actually reach its full adult shape and width until the late teens or early 20s. By pushing reproduction into the early teens, ancient societies were essentially forcing a biological square peg through a round hole, and the cost was paid in an astronomical maternal mortality rate. This creates another contradiction. If it was so dangerous, why didn't these populations just go extinct? You would think the loss of so many young women would be a self-correcting problem. But that's where we overlook the invisible support system that made the impossible survivable. This is often called the grandmother hypothesis. Evolutionary biologists like Kristen Hawkes have argued that one of the reasons humans can survive such risky, early reproduction is because we are one of the only species on Earth where females live long past their reproductive years. In an ancient village, a 13-year-old mother wasn't raising a child alone in an apartment. She was part of a multi-generational alloparenting network. She had her own mother, her aunts, and her grandmother, women who were no longer having their own children but who possessed decades of knowledge about breastfeeding, infant care, and herbal medicine. These older women were the biological buffers that allowed a young girl's body to survive the transition to motherhood. They provided the extra calories, the protection, and the labor that the young mother couldn't provide herself. This social structure essentially tricked the mortality math. It allowed the group to start the reproductive cycle as early as possible while using the collective strength of the elders to keep both the mother and the infant alive. Without the grandmother, the 12-year-old mother would have been an evolutionary dead end. With her, she was the foundation of the next generation. It's tempting to look at this support system and think that ancient life was a harmonious, communal experience that we've simply lost. But the truth is that this communal living was a response to a world that was trying to kill them at every turn. The pressure of early childbirth changed again with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, but not in the way you might expect. As we moved into cities and diets changed, the age of first menstruation, menarche, began to plummet. In the early 1800s, the average age of a girl's first period was around 17. Today, in many Western countries, it is 12 or 13. We are living in a bizarre historical moment where our bodies are ready for reproduction earlier than ever before in human history, yet our society has pushed the social age of motherhood later than ever before. This gap, the decade or more where the body is biologically capable of having children but the mind and the social structure are not ready, is a completely new invention. For our ancestors, there was no gap. The moment the body signaled it could handle a pregnancy, the social machinery of the tribe or the family moved to ensure that pregnancy happened. To them, the idea of waiting 15 years after your first period to have a child would have seemed like madness, a literal wasting of the only thing that mattered, the chance to keep the flame of life burning. They didn't have children at 12 because they were ignorant of the risks. They did it because the risk of waiting was, in their world, much higher. However, recognizing the logic of their world doesn't mean we have to romanticize the pain of the girls who lived in it. We have to look at the data of the secular trend, the name scientists give to the long-term decrease in the age of puberty. Research by scholars like Peter Gluckman has shown that as nutrition improves and childhood disease vanishes, the body decides it is safe to mature faster. We have created a world so calorie-rich and so safe that our biology is screaming at us that it's time to reproduce before we've even finished middle school. The only thing standing between us and the return to 12-year-old motherhood is the culture we have built, the schools, the laws, and the shared belief that childhood is a period of development rather than just a waiting room for labor. This brings us to a fundamental shift in how we view the human story. We often think of history as a series of great men and great battles, but the most important war in our history was the one fought inside the female body. It was a constant, grinding struggle between the limitations of the skeleton, the requirements of the brain, and the brutal mortality of the environment. Every person reading or listening to this is the survivor of that war. You are the descendant of a line of women who, for thousands of generations, managed to navigate the lethal transition from child to mother under conditions that would break a modern human. When we see the skeletal remains of a teenager buried with her newborn from 5,000 years ago, we aren't looking at a mistake or a freak occurrence. We are looking at the price of our existence. We are looking at a girl who took the ultimate gamble for a future she would never see. The reason she had a child at 12 or 13 wasn't a lack of morals or a lack of care. It was a profound, desperate commitment to the idea that the story should continue no matter the cost. We have the luxury of calling it history, but for her, it was the only math that mattered. It's easy to judge the past through the lens of our current safety. We live in a world of antibiotics, ultrasounds, and grocery stores, a world where a woman can expect to live 80 years and choose exactly when, or she wants to bring a life into it. We have untethered our biology from the survival of the species. But that tether was once a chokehold. The 12-year-old mother of the ancient world wasn't a different kind of human than we are today. She had the same fears, the same capacity for pain, and the same dreams for her future. The difference is that her future was measured in months, not decades. She didn't have the luxury of an adolescence because her world didn't have the luxury of a surplus. Every calorie was a negotiation with death, and every child was a hedge against the void. We have spent the last few centuries trying to build a world where a 12-year-old can just be a child, where she can worry about her grades or her friends instead of the shape of her pelvis or the probability of a famine. That is the great, quiet achievement of our civilization. We haven't just conquered disease and hunger, we have conquered the necessity of the biological sprint. We have given ourselves the gift of time, a gift that every one of our ancestors would have found unrecognizable. As we look back at those ancient lives, we shouldn't see them as primitive or barbaric. We should see them as the people who stood in the breach. They lived through the high mortality nightmare so that we could live in the low mortality dream. They accepted the brutal trade-offs of life history theory so that we could eventually opt out of the game entirely. The 12-year-old mothers of our past are the reason we have the freedom to think of 12-year-olds as children today. Their sacrifice is the foundation of our comfort, and their trauma is the hidden price of our peace. When you really dig into the bones and the laws and the evolutionary math, the question isn't, why did they have kids so young? The real question is, how did they survive it at all? The answer is that they didn't, at least not always. They died in staggering numbers to ensure that the chain wasn't broken. They pushed their developing bodies to the point of collapse because the alternative was the total silence of their people. We are the beneficiaries of a biological struggle that was as consistent as it was cruel. And so, we return to that original image, a 12-year-old girl in an ancient village, standing on the threshold of a life that will be defined by constant labor and the very real possibility of a premature grave. To us, she is a tragedy. To her community, she was the only hope for a tomorrow. We have moved so far from that reality that it feels like a different planet, but that girl's DNA is the script from which your own body was written. She is not a distant stranger, she is the mother of us all. Our modern world is many things, chaotic, fast, stressful, but it is also a sanctuary. It is a place where we have finally managed to silence the brutal calculations of survival that once dictated every beat of a human heart. The transition from that world to ours was not a smooth climb. It was a jagged, bloody ascent. It was built on the backs of millions of young women who never got to grow up, whose lives were consumed by the needs of a species that was always one bad harvest away from blinking out. When we think about the good old days, or the natural way of living, we should remember the pit in the pelvis and the infant in the grave. We should remember that nature's way is not kind, it is efficient. And efficiency has no room for childhood. The fact that we can even have this conversation, that we can analyze the math of the past from the safety of the present, is the ultimate proof of how much has changed. We have broken the cycle. We have rewritten the laws of life and death that governed our ancestors for 1,000,000 years. We have decided that the cost of survival shouldn't be the childhood of half the population. It is perhaps the most significant thing we have ever done as a species. We didn't just invent tools and language, we invented the right to grow up before we are asked to give life away. The luxury of a childhood is a debt paid in full by the children who never got one. We look back at the young mothers of antiquity and see a past that feels impossible to reconcile with our own values. We see 12-year-olds in the Roman legal records and teenagers in prehistoric burial mounds, and we feel a deep, instinctive relief that we are not them. But we must never forget that their survival was the bridge that brought us to this shore. They lived in a world where the only way to beat the clock was to start it as soon as possible. We have the privilege of ignoring the clock, of letting our children be children, and of delaying the burdens of adulthood until we are ready to carry them. It is a beautiful, fragile state of affairs, one that was bought with the literal blood and bone of those who came before us. Every time we look at a 12-year-old today, we are seeing a miracle of history. We are seeing a human being who has been granted the one thing the ancient world could never provide: the time to become themselves. That time was earned through thousands of years of brutal mortality math, through the support of grandmothers in drafty caves, and through the sheer, stubborn persistence of a species that refused to die out. The ancient mother at 12 wasn't a choice, she was a necessity. And the fact that she is now a memory is the greatest victory we have ever won. The ledger of human history is filled with the names of those who were forced to grow up in an instant, so that one day, we wouldn't have to. The path to our present was paved with the bodies of girls who were never allowed to be anything else. We are here because they were there, trapped in a math that only cared about the next generation, never the one currently breathing. You are the ending they were all working toward. You are the first generation in history that is allowed to belong to itself. Don't ever forget that you are living in the only era where being 12 doesn't mean being a parent, it just means being alive. Your existence is the final, heavy gavel strike on a million years of desperate, bloody survival.